Welcome to the second part of 3.5. Today we're going to talk operations with matrices. Only two vocab terms for this section. We've got a scalar, that is a constant term that is multiplied into the matrix, so basically we're going to multiply it with all of the elements in the matrix. And we also have scalar multiplication, and that is the actual operation of that scalar being multiplied into the matrix. So the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to add and subtract matrices together. And in order to do that, they have to have the same dimensions. If they don't have the same dimensions, then we cannot add or subtract them together. So if we're adding matrices together, we're going to add the elements that are in the same position in both matrices together to get the new element that's going to be in that same spot. To subtract the matrices, you take the element of the second one and you subtract it from the element of the first one, and that takes the place in that same spot. So here's our first example. So we've got these two matrices being added together. The first thing we have to do is make sure they have the same dimensions. They both have 2 rows. They both have 2 columns. So we're good to go. We can add them together. So now in order to add these together, we're going to add the numbers that are in the same position. So I'm going to take 16 plus a negative 4. 16 plus a negative 4 gives me 12. So 12 is the new number in that position. I can take 2 plus a negative 1. That gives me a 1. I can take negative 9 plus a negative 3. That gets me a negative 12. And I've got 8 plus a negative 7. That gets me 1. So when I add those two matrices together, this is the matrix that I end up with. So now I have another one here. Again, I need to check to see if I can add them together. I've got 1 row in both, 3 columns in both, so I can add them together. And the answer is going to have the same dimensions as both of them. So it's going to be a 1/3 answer. So when I go and add these together, I add the first numbers together, negative 8 plus 11. That gets me 3. 2 plus a negative 7. That gets me a negative 5. And 6 plus 1 gets me 7. So when I add them together, this is my resulting matrix. Our last example for adding, okay, we've got these two matrices, we're going to add them together. Okay, if I look at the rows, I've got the same number of rows. The first one has 2 columns, whereas the second one has 1. Okay, these are not the same, so I can't add them together. Okay, so we cannot combine those. Doing some subtraction examples here. Again, we've got these two, and I'm going to subtract. Again, I have to make sure that they're all the same. 2 rows, 2 columns in both. They are the same, so I can add them, or I can subtract them. So when I go about doing that, I'm going to subtract the same values now. So the first minus that first, 16 minus a negative 4 gives me 20. 2 minus a negative 1 gets me 3. Negative 9 minus a negative 3 gets me a negative 6. And 8 minus a negative 7 gives me 15. So when I subtract them, this is the answer that I get. Here's another example. Again, I'm subtracting. So again, I check. They both have 1 row. They both have 3 columns, so I can in fact subtract them. First minus first, negative 8 minus 11 gets me a negative 19. If I subtract the next ones, 2 minus a negative 7 gets me 9. And for the last one, 6 minus 1 gets me 5. So my resulting matrix is this one right here. For our last example, we are going to subtract these two matrices. Again, first thing we have to do is check. I got 2 rows, 2 rows. I have 2 columns. Here I only have 1 column. Again, they're not the same, so I cannot subtract them. Okay, they have to have the same dimensions. So in this case, I can't subtract them. I'd have to leave it the way it is. Go ahead and pause the video, solve these two, and then hit play and see how you did. Okay, so both of them work. We can subtract and add both of these because the dimensions are the same. If we do the first one, we should get 1, -8, -17, and 2. If we do the second one, we should get -13, 5, 9, -11, -1, and +11. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to multiply a matrix by a scalar. So in order to do that, we take each element in the matrix and multiply it by that scalar value that is given to us. So for our first example, we've got our matrix here, and our scalar is going to be 5. So I'm going to take every element inside of the matrix and multiply it by 5. So if I take 5 times -12, I get a -60. 5 times 8 is 40. 5 times 6 is 30. 5 times a -16 gives me a -80. 5 times 4 is 20. And 5 times 19 is 95. So here is my resulting matrix. We can also have a negative scalar like this one. So we've got this matrix and we're going to multiply it by a -4. So I'm going to take all of the elements times a -4. -4 times 8 gets me a -32. -4 times 0 stays at 0. -4 times 3 is a -12. -4 times -2 gives me a +8. -4 times -1 gives me a +4. -4 times -4 gives me a +16. -4 times -2 is a +8 again. And -4 times 9 gives me a -36. So here is my resulting matrix. Go ahead and pause the video, complete these multiplications, and hit play and see how you did. So here's what you should have gotten for those two matrices. Go ahead and check out your work before moving on. So now we're going to combine those two. We're going to add and subtract while multiplying by a scalar at the same time. And we can do that as long as we follow the same order that we would use for real numbers. And to do that, remember, we follow our order of operations. Parentheses, exponents, multiplication and division, and then add and subtract. Now we won't really do a whole lot with these first two, but mainly we're going to be focusing on these. So obviously we multiply first before we add or subtract. So here's our first example. You'll notice we have scalars for both matrices and we are going to subtract at the same time. So the first thing we want to do is we want to multiply inside of our matrices. Okay, so I'm going to multiply this -4 in first. -4 times -4 gives me 16. -4 times -8 gives me 32. -4 times 2 gives me a -8. And -4 times 13 gives me 12. I'll multiply the 3 into the second one. 3 times -9 is -27. 3 times 12 is 36. 3 times 2 is 6. And 3 times -6 is a -18. So I've got my two new matrices here, and now I'm going to subtract them just like I would at the beginning. 16 minus a -27, that's going to get me 43. 32 minus 36 gets me a -4. -8 minus 6 gets me a -14. And 12 minus a -18 gives me a +30. So here is my end matrix. So here's our next one. Go ahead and pause the video and solve this problem and then hit play and see how you did. So go ahead and check your work here, but when it's all said and done, the elements in the matrix should be -107, -9, 12, -32, -10, and +105.